could say it's 7% or it's 3%. The line between normal and mentally ill may be clearly debatable, but the extremities are clear. And there are some people who are extremely seriously mentally ill. The interesting thing about this 4% who are seriously mentally ill, 40% of them receive zero treatment. Zero, zilch, nada, nunca, nothing. To put it in a California context, of the 30 million adults in California, about 1.2 million have serious mental illness, and 40% of those, or 480,000, receive zero treatment. And this is in spite of the massive federal spending, Mental Health Services Act spending. Now, one of the things about half of this 4% has in common is they have something called anosognosia. Their brain is the organ affected. The brain is the organ charged with regulating behavior, and so the brain can't do that right. The way I explain this is, if you see somebody walking down the street, and I've been told in California you don't walk down the street a lot, but in New York we walk around a lot. And if you see someone coming at you and they are screaming, "I am the Messiah," they do not think they're the Messiah. That's ridiculous. They don't think it. They know it. Their illness tells them they are the Messiah. And the problem they perceive is that the rest of the world isn't recognizing them as the Messiah. They don't perceive that they need treatment. They perceive the rest of the world has to come to the recognition how important they are. And it is people with anosognosia, a small part of the 4%, who are responsible for many of the problems we have. Now, John Hinckley, who shot President Reagan, did so because he knew for a fact that was the best way to get a date with Jodie Foster. In his mind, oh, I want a date with Jodie Foster, I'm going to shoot President Reagan. Russell Weston, who shot 2 guards at the U.S. Capitol, did so because he knew there was a ruby red time reversal system in the basement and he wanted access to it. And I'm not going to go through more of these tragedies, but we've had many of them. Now, rarely do even the seriously mentally ill, who are untreated, create tragedies like that. But they do become tragedies. They become homeless, vagrant. They get arrested for stalking. They get arrested for dining and dashing. They think they're married to a celebrity. They're tearing families apart. Families are having to get orders of protection. So while the tragedies rarely make the news, they're not usually these violent incidents, which I do use because the public understands those, but they do become tragedies. And so the tragedies for the seriously ill aren't uncommon. And the question is, why is that and what should we do about it? Why are the seriously ill not getting treated? The problem nationwide, I'll take questions at the end. The problem nationwide, and specifically in California, is that we are spending way too much on mental health and not enough for the seriously mentally ill. And this is what's driving a lot of it. And the other realization that I came to during this, which was surprising, was it is mental health advocates like me who were responsible for the problem. I spent 30 years in NAMI teaching the public, teaching legislators stuff that, because I was believing what goes on, that simply turned out not to be true. If there's one thing you take away, this is my message. It is us mental health advocates who are responsible for the problem. It is not everybody else in the world. As a result of the system we've created, the least symptomatic and highest functioning are going to the head of the line for services, while the seriously mentally ill are going to jails, shelters, prisons, and morgues. Think about it. We used to have a hospital-based system. Now, most people don't need a hospital, but hospitals, by definition, serve the seriously ill. Now we have a community-based system. But that community-based system refuses to serve those who were so symptomatic before they would have needed a hospital. They have a name for them. These are high needs patients, and we're not set up for high needs patients. Or they have anosognosia, they won't volunteer. We're not set up for people who won't volunteer. Or they're substance abusers, we're not set up for those people. So the community-based system is largely not serving, and I'm glad I stopped myself. There are many good programs, and I assume that this is one of them, and I'm not talking about any specific program, but this generally is what's going on nationwide. Homelessness, arrest, incarceration, needless hospitalization, and victimization are the insane consequences of letting the seriously ill go untreated, not letting the worried well go untreated. So the big idea is to focus our existing spending on the most seriously ill. Replace mission creep with mission control. We have to spend where the problem is, treating people with serious mental illness, not improving mental wellness in all others. We need to focus on the elephant in the room, which is the seriously ill. Now, everyone says more money is the solution. Maybe. My experience generally is that more money doesn't go to the seriously ill. It goes to stigma campaigns, or it goes to preventing illnesses that can't be prevented. Cutbacks always go to the seriously ill. We cut back hospitals, we won't fund Laura's Law, we won't fund electroconvulsive therapy. So more money doesn't help if it doesn't go to the seriously ill. And later I'm going to talk California specifically, and there are several bills pending, billed as mental illness bills, but have provisions that allow diversion of the funds elsewhere. Now I'm going to go through a bunch of ways as the industry does two things, and by this I mean NAMIs, Mental Health America. Local NAMIs are great, by the way, but I'm talking about the National Alliance of Mentally Ill, and also I have to confess I'm talking about the California Alliance for the Mentally Ill. How do people divert, they do two things. One is they divert resources to programs that don't help the mentally ill, and they oppose programs that do help the seriously mentally ill. And I'm going to talk about both those, how they divert funds away to programs that don't help. Look where spending goes. The industry diverts funds by inventing new illnesses. When I grew up, bullying was bad behavior. You were a bully, that was bad behavior. Now it's a mental illness, and mental health services funds go to that. Cyberbullying didn't exist because I'm too old, but now that's also a mental illness. Trauma is another big one. Trauma has never been a mental illness, and yet we in the mental health industry say trauma is an illness and we have to address trauma. Everyone loses a parent, experiences a fire, maybe witnesses violence, maybe gets in an accident and has something horrible to them. Unfortunately, that's part of life. Now, PTSD is a mental illness, but even PTSD can run from mild to severe. But we've now taught the funders, we've taught the politicians that we have to do more on trauma when it's not a mental illness. And look at it. In World War II and I, we used to have something called shell shock. That was the precursor to modern day PTSD. But to get a diagnosis of shell shock during the wars, you had to have flashbacks, trembling, vomiting, sweating, uncontrolled defecation, and catatonia. Today, if you have a bad dream and a memory, you've got PTSD, and federal funds are going to run to you. Not that there aren't severe forms of PTSD. Prevention, and this is a big one in California. I mentioned that 4% of this, there are 4% who have a serious and persistent mental illness, the most seriously ill who we should focus on. Now, any disease or any mental illness can rise to serious. For instance, somebody with OCD may work fine, and others may not be able to leave the house because they're afraid they didn't turn off the lights. Somebody with borderline personality may be able to get through work, while somebody else is too unable to be with other people to get a job. So any illness can be serious. But the two biggest ones that compromise the bulk of the 4% are schizophrenia spectrum disorders and bipolar disorders. And bipolar is fortunately for many people, is readily treated. But those are the two big ones. Now, we're spending money on prevention. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder cannot be prevented. There will be a Nobel Prize to anyone who figures that out. But the mental health advocates go to the politicians, and it sounds so logical. You know, if we prevent mental illness, we'll save money down the road. Well, you can't prevent serious mental illness. This is one of the myths that I used to teach myself. The industry diverts funds to kids. Kids have become a major focus. Now, some kids do have serious mental illness, but we are diverting funds to kids without mental illness at the expense of those with it and at the expense of adults with mental illness. The industry regularly goes in front of politicians. Half of all mental illness begins before age 14. It's part of the mantra. So therefore, we should spend on people under 14. Again, the fact that is true. It's not like anyone's lying, but most of those are minor mental illnesses, minor disorders that people grow out of. For instance, I have no doubt that had I been in school today, I'd be ADHD. Basically, kids have issues. If you're not at the exact right place on the bell curve, we're diagnosing children. Not that there aren't children who don't have serious mental illnesses, but the minor mental illnesses in kids, 50% of it is anxiety, ADHD, and minor depression. The minor ones generally go away with no treatment. They outgrow it. Some don't. Some go on to become more serious. But serious mental illnesses begins in late teens and early 20s. Not serious mental illness is an adult, not childhood disease. And we're overdiagnosing children. I think it's 40% of school-age boys now have an ADHD diagnosis. Bipolar in children is another. Bipolar in children really exists, but we are having an explosion of it. Not because there's any new incidence of bipolar in children, but because in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the American Psychiatric Association made it easier to qualify for. And the editor of that was a guy named Dr. Alan Francis, and he was editor of DSM-4, and he wrote a whole book basically apologizing for what he did by allowing these diagnoses to get into the manual. It's called Saving Normal. Focusing on children who don't have a mental illness is taking away from children who really have a serious emotional disturbance. Big one in California, suicide campaigns. The industry is devoting massive funds to suicide campaigns. Let me say, first of all, suicide is a tragedy for any family that experiences. So is death in a car crash and other things. You lose a family member and you want to do something. There is zero evidence that suicide campaigns reduce suicide. There is minor evidence that they increase it. They do increase awareness of illness, but they don't reduce the number of suicides. So the mental health industry, every mental health program provider loves doing a TV ad or a radio spot or a billboard or a brochure that has their logo on it. We're reducing suicide. No evidence that those reduce suicide. And in fact, they're targeting their suicide efforts to those least likely to commit suicide. For instance, suicide is primarily an adult disorder. The industry regularly claims that suicide is the second leading cause of death of people under 24. They go on the second leading cause of death under 24, and you think, wow, that's really big. We ought to do something about that. But the fact is, very few children take their own lives. Of the 43,000 suicides in 2015, 5,500 were under 24 and 37,500 over it. Where did spending go? The government spent $54 million on the under 24 and only $2 million on the over 24. If we really want to reduce suicide, we have to target to those most likely. Instead, we're going into the schools and we're going into the colleges. The colleges is another bad one. In that same age group, people who don't go to college are more likely to commit suicide than those who do go to college. But more importantly, who's most likely to take their own life? It's someone who tried it before. We have their names. They were taken to the hospital as a result of their attempt. We could focus efforts on treatment for those people. The elderly, suicide is far more common in people over 55 than it is in younger people. People with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder do have a somewhat increased risk of suicide. And if you really want to reduce suicide, you're altruistic and suicide is the thing, the people most common to commit suicide are prisoners. So you can focus on making jail cells safer and guards less oppressive. Suicide funds is largely a waste of money. Identifying the asymptomatic is another way that the industry wastes money. Is mental health first aid used in this county? Mental health first aid, okay. So mental health first aid is a program. We're going to teach the public how to identify people who are so asymptomatic that special training is needed for them. And then we're going to refer them to services. First of all, it's not the asymptomatic who regularly become problems. Secondly, there is zero evidence that mental health first aid helps people with mental illness. There's extensive evidence that those who give the training like it and those who receive the training like it, but there's no evidence that it affects the number of people getting mental health services. And it's not that they haven't tested it. They took 2 dormitories, they gave everyone in one mental health first aid training, they didn't give anyone in the other dorm mental health first aid training, and they found that there was no difference in the use of mental health services. Identifying the asymptomatic fixes a problem that doesn't exist. Every day I get calls from moms and dads and brothers and sisters begging for treatment for seriously mentally ill who need treatment and cannot get it. Delivering treatment to the seriously ill is the problem that needs fixing, not identifying the asymptomatic. California could identify all the people they want if they believe identification is a problem by putting a social worker outside the jails, hospitals, shelters, where the people, and the homeless camps where the mentally ill are. Going into schools to teach kids how to identify asymptomatic fixes a problem that doesn't exist. Reducing violence. The mental health industry is adamant that we not